On the morning of August 22nd, 1553, John Dudley climbed the scaffold at Tower Hill not as a defiant hero, but as a broken man. In a humiliating final act of desperation, he fell to his knees and publicly renounced the very religion he had championed, hoping to buy a shred of mercy from a crowd that only wanted his blood. The axe fell, ending his life in a moment of absolute shame, instantly transforming the most powerful man in England into a headless corpse amidst the jeers of his enemies. It is hard to reconcile this pathetic figure with the uncrowned king, who had masterminded the effort to pull England back from the brink of bankruptcy and ended its ruinous wars. He was the brilliant strategist who stabilized the economy and secured the borders, only to lose everything, his head, his honor, and his legacy, on one fatal power play. John Dudley was born in London around 1504, entering a world of immense privilege that sat on a foundation of sand. His mother, Elizabeth Grey, carried the blue blood of the aristocracy, tracing her lineage back to the heroes of the 100 Years' War. But the defining figure of his life was his father, Edmund Dudley. Edmund was one of the most powerful and arguably the most hated men in the entire kingdom. He was the financial enforcer for King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. Henry VII was a king who lived in constant fear of rebellion, and he believed the best way to keep the nobility loyal was to keep them poor. Edmund Dudley was his instrument. He was a lawyer with a razor-sharp mind and no conscience, the president of the King's Council, who made a career out of squeezing money from the nobility through archaic fines, bonds, and obscure laws. He filled the king's coffers with gold and filled the court with enemies. Young John grew up in a household that smelled of ink, parchment, and fear. He would have seen the greatest lords of England bowing to his father, their eyes filled with hatred. He lived in luxury, unaware that every coin that paid for his velvet doublets was essentially stolen. Then, in 1509, the wheel of fortune turned with brutal speed. The old king, Henry VII, died. His son, the 18-year-old Henry VIII, burst onto the scene like a golden sun. The young Henry was everything his father was not: athletic, charming, and desperate to be loved. To secure that love, he needed to distance himself from his father's miserly reign. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a sacrifice to throw to the wolves. Edmund Dudley was arrested almost immediately. In 1510, when John was just 6 years old, the nightmare began. His father was dragged to Tower Hill. A massive crowd gathered, not to mourn, but to cheer. They roared with approval as the axe severed the head of the man who had taxed them into misery. For a 6-year-old boy, the horror did not end with the execution. The death of his father was only the beginning of the punishment. The Dudley family was hit with a bill of attainder. In the modern world, if a parent commits a crime, the child is innocent. In Tudor England, the law was far more cruel. Attainder was a form of civil death. It didn't just mean the government confiscated your houses, your land, and your money. It meant your blood was legally declared corrupt. You ceased to be a legal person. You could not inherit. You could not hold titles. You essentially did not exist. Overnight, John Dudley went from being the heir to a fortune to a penniless, nameless orphan, carrying the toxic stain of a traitor. He was cast out of his home, the son of the leech, a pariah before he had even lost his milk teeth. That psychological wound is the key that unlocks his entire adult life. It created a void in his soul that no amount of power could ever fill. Everything he did later, every battle fought, every ruthless political maneuver, every risk taken, was a desperate attempt to wash away that stain. He was fighting a lifelong war to prove that a Dudley could be more than just a traitor. Destiny, however, was not done with John Dudley. In the Tudor system, high-born orphans became wards of the crown, sold or given to guardians. Fate intervened in the form of Sir Edward Guildford, a masterful courtier and the master of the armory. Guildford saw something in the boy, perhaps a spark of his father's intelligence, perhaps just pity. He took John into his household not as a servant, but as a foster son. This was the saving grace. Guildford did not treat John as a pariah. He lobbied tirelessly at court, using his influence with the young king Henry VIII. In 1512, thanks to Guildford's persistence, Parliament reversed the attainder. It was a miracle. John got his name back. He was legally restored in blood. However, the crown kept his father's vast fortune. John Dudley was now a person again, but he was a pauper with a noble name, forced to live on the charity of his guardian. He grew up in the Guildford household in Kent and Sussex, surrounded by the machinery of war. Sir Edward Guildford was a military man, and under his tutelage, John was immersed in the martial arts. He didn't just learn them, he mastered them. He realized early on that since he had no money to buy his way into power, he would have to carve his path with a sword. He became a physical specimen, tall, athletic, and devastatingly skilled with the lance and the longbow. He learned the intricate, deadly dance of court etiquette, how to speak to powerful men without trembling, and how to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of pleasantry. It was in the Guildford household that John found something exceedingly rare for a Tudor striver: genuine love. Usually marriages in this stratum of society were cold business transactions, acres of land traded for titles. But around 1525, John Dudley married his guardian's daughter, Jane Guildford. It was not a strategic alliance. John had no land, and Jane could have done better. It was a match of affection. Jane Guildford was a remarkable woman, intelligent, educated, and deeply loyal. Their marriage became the bedrock of John's life. In an era where kings beheaded wives and dukes kept open mistresses, the Dudley marriage was an anomaly. It was deeply, fiercely happy. They would have 13 children together. This creates the first major contradiction in the life of the wicked duke. The man history remembers as a ruthless, cold-blooded dictator was, by all contemporary accounts, a devoted, faithful, and loving family man. His ambition was not just for himself, it was for them. He wanted to build a fortress of power so high and so strong that the government could never again destroy his family as it had destroyed his father. By his mid-20s, John Dudley was ready to make his mark. He threw himself into the chaotic, glamorous violence of Henry VIII's court. King Henry VIII saw himself as a warrior king, a reincarnation of Henry V. To impress him, you had to be good at what he loved, jousting and war. John Dudley was exceptional at both. He became a star of the tilt yard, shattering lances against the best knights in Europe. But he wasn't just a brute in armor. He had a modern, strategic mind. He earned his knighthood on the battlefields of France in 1523, serving under the Duke of Suffolk. The campaign was a disaster of mud and disease, but Dudley displayed a reckless bravery that got him noticed. Yet it was not on land, but on the sea, that Dudley would show his true genius. We often think of Sir Francis Drake or Horatio Nelson when we think of the Royal Navy, but John Dudley is one of its true unsung architects. In the 1530s and 40s, England's navy was still a medieval concept, a collection of merchant ships hired temporarily when war broke out. Dudley, rising through the ranks to become Lord High Admiral in 1543, realized this was obsolete. He understood that the future of warfare lay in a permanent, professional, standing navy. He established the Council for Marine Causes, the direct forerunner to the Admiralty Board. He wasn't just sitting behind a desk in London, he was out on the water, smelling the salt and the gunpowder. He personally oversaw the design of new ships, advocating for vessels that were faster and carried heavier guns lower in the hull. More importantly, he revolutionized naval tactics. Before Dudley, sea battles were essentially land battles on water. Ships crashed into each other and men hacked away with swords. Dudley wrote the first fighting instructions that emphasized firepower. He taught his captains to fight in coordinated formations, to use the wind, and to blast the enemy from a distance with cannonades rather than rambling into chaotic boarding actions. He turned the Navy from a floating transport service into a lethal weapon of state. While Dudley was building ships, the court of Henry VIII was descending into madness. The 1530s and 40s were a bloodbath. Queens were beheaded, ministers were executed, and the religious ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Dudley possessed a terrifying political instinct: survival. He saw the fall of Cardinal Wolsey. He saw the rise and brutal execution of Thomas Cromwell. He watched the Howards and the Boleyns tear each other apart. Through it all, Dudley kept his head. He was a chameleon. When the king was Catholic, Dudley was Catholic. When the king leaned towards reform, Dudley leaned with him. However, beneath the surface, a genuine religious conversion was taking root. Dudley became a leading figure of the growing reformist faction, the evangelicals, or Protestants. He became a patron to radical preachers, protecting them from the flames of heresy laws. But he was careful. He never let his faith outshine his loyalty to the king. His service to Henry VIII came at a terrible personal cost. In 1544, Henry launched another massive invasion of France. The target was the city of Boulogne. Dudley was the architect of the amphibious operation, managing the logistics of getting thousands of men and horses across the channel. During the siege, his eldest son, Henry Dudley, only 19 years old, was caught in the line of fire. He was killed in action. Dudley was the commander who eventually captured Boulogne, handing the keys of the city to the king in a moment of triumph. But the victory was ashes in his mouth. He had restored his family name, he had regained the fortune his father lost, and he was now a viscount. But the attainder of death had claimed his firstborn. It was a stark, brutal reminder that the ambition he possessed was a hungry beast that demanded the highest price. By 1546, Henry VIII was dying. The Golden Prince had become a rotting, obese tyrant, terrified of death and lashing out at shadows. The court split into two deadly factions: the conservatives, who wanted to keep the old religion, and the reformers, who wanted a Protestant future. It was a race to see who would control the king's will, and more importantly, who would control the 9-year-old heir, Prince Edward. Dudley played his hand perfectly. He allied with Seymour to purge the conservatives. When the monstrous Henry VIII finally took his last breath in January 1547, the reformers were standing by the bed. With the colossus of Henry VIII finally cold in his grave, the vacuum of power he left behind threatened to swallow the kingdom whole. The old king had designed a balanced council to prevent tyranny, but he had underestimated the sheer ambition of the men he left behind to guard his son. As the heralds cried, "The king is dead, long live the king," John Dudley stood poised on the edge of history, watching as the chessboard was instantly overturned. He was ready to serve, but he quickly realized that in this new unstable world, service would not be enough. One would have to rule or be ruled. When Henry VIII died, the air in London did not feel lighter. It felt thin, brittle, ready to snap. The crown now belonged to Edward VI, a 9-year-old boy with pale skin and an intense, searching gaze. But a boy cannot rule a kingdom surrounded by wolves. Henry VIII, in his final paranoid years, had foreseen this danger. His last will and testament was a masterwork of checks and balances. He had designated a regency council of 16 executors, men of differing religious and political stripes, who were supposed to rule collectively by majority vote until Edward came of age. No single man was to hold the keys to the kingdom. It took Edward Seymour exactly 3 days to shred the old king's will. Seymour, the young king's uncle, was a man of soaring ambition masked by a veneer of pious idealism. While the other counselors were still dazed by Henry's death, Seymour maneuvered with lightning speed. He bribed key figures, made secret deals, and physically took possession of the young king. By the time the council formally met, it was a fait accompli. Seymour declared himself Lord Protector of the realm and governor of the king's person. He elevated himself to the title of Duke of Somerset. He was now, in all but name, the King of England. Where was John Dudley during this coup? He was right there, watching. Dudley, now 43 years old, was arguably the most capable man in the room. He could have challenged Seymour. He could have rallied the other counselors and pointed out that Seymour was violating the sacred will of Henry VIII. But Dudley was a pragmatist, not a martyr. He saw the way the wind was blowing. He knew that Seymour, as the king's uncle, held the biological trump card. So, Dudley made a calculation. He supported Seymour's power grab. In exchange for his loyalty, Dudley was made Earl of Warwick and Lord Great Chamberlain. It was a handsome bribe, but for a man of Dudley's ability, it must have stung to play second fiddle to Seymour, a man who possessed all of Dudley's ambition, but arguably half of his competence. The new regime needed a victory to cement its legitimacy. They found their war in Scotland. The English wanted to force a marriage between the young King Edward VI and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, to unite the two crowns, a policy violently dubbed the rough wooing. In September 1547, a massive English army marched north. Somerset was the nominal commander, the figurehead riding in front, but the tactical brain of the army, the man actually organizing the formations and logistics, was John Dudley. The two armies met at Pinkie Clough, near Musselburgh. It should have been a disaster for the English. They were outnumbered. The Scots held a strong defensive position behind the River Esk, but Dudley had brought something the Scots didn't understand: modern, combined arms warfare. As the Scottish pike squares, massive prickly hedgehogs of spears, advanced, they expected a traditional medieval clash. Instead, Dudley unleashed hell. He had coordinated with his fleet offshore. Suddenly, English warships anchored in the Firth opened fire, their heavy cannons tearing through the flank of the Scottish army. It was a slaughter by geometry. As the Scots wavered under the naval bombardment, Dudley launched his cavalry. It wasn't a reckless charge. It was a calculated fixing maneuver to pin the enemy in place so the English artillery and arquebusiers could shatter them. The Battle of Pinkie Clough was a massacre. The rivers ran red. It remains one of the most crushing defeats in Scottish history. Somerset took the credit in London, printing pamphlets extolling his own glory. But the soldiers knew the truth. The veterans, the captains, and the grim-faced men in the ranks knew that the victory belonged to the genius of the Earl of Warwick. Dudley had proven he was the finest general of his generation. Back in London, however, the Lord Protector was failing. Edward Seymour has gone down in history with the romantic nickname the Good Duke. Historians in the Victorian era loved him because he claimed to care about the poor. He spoke passionately against the enclosures, the practice where greedy landlords fenced off common village land to graze sheep, driving peasants into starvation. Seymour set up commissions to tear down these fences. He presented himself as the champion of the common man against the greedy gentry. It was a beautiful sentiment. It was also catastrophic politics. Seymour was an idealist with no grasp of reality. His enclosure commissions didn't actually help the poor. They just raised their hopes dangerously high while terrifying the landowners who ran the economy. He ruled by decree, ignoring the council, ignoring Dudley, treating his colleagues like servants. He spent a fortune building a magnificent palace while the crown's finances collapsed. Inflation was rampant. The coinage was debased. The people were hungry. By the summer of 1549, the country snapped. The mixture of religious confusion, economic despair, and a breakdown of authority created a powder keg. The explosion came in the form of the Year of the Many-Headed Monster. Rebellions erupted across the realm. The real threat, the one that nearly toppled the Tudor state, rose in the east. In Norfolk, a prosperous tanner and landowner named Robert Kett assumed leadership of a massive uprising. This wasn't a riot. It was a revolution. Kett was organized. He gathered 16,000 men, peasants, yeomen, disaffected tradesmen, and set up a vast camp on Mousehold Heath, overlooking the city of Norwich. They weren't a disorganized rabble. They established their own court under a great oak tree, which they named the Oak of Reformation. They captured gentry and put them on trial for greed. They maintained strict discipline. They essentially created a rival state within England. In London, Somerset paralyzed. This was his nightmare. These were the poor commons he claimed to love, now armed and demanding justice. He vacillated. He offered pardons, then retracted them. He sent a small, incompetent force under the Marquis of Northampton, which Kett's rebels easily defeated in a street battle in Norwich. The humiliation was total. The second largest city in England was in the hands of rebels. The king's government looked impotent. The privy councillors were terrified, whispering that the end of the world had come. They turned to the only man capable of saving them. They turned to John Dudley. Dudley didn't want this mission. Leading an army against your own people is a no-win scenario. If you lose, you die. If you win, you are a butcher. But he had no choice. The state was collapsing. In August 1549, Dudley marched to Norfolk. He didn't take a feudal levy. He took a professional force, including 1,200 German mercenaries, landsknechts, hired gunmen, who felt no kinship with the English peasants. When Dudley arrived at Norwich, the dynamic changed instantly. He wasn't Somerset. He didn't send vague letters. He sent a herald to the rebels with a final offer: surrender now and live, or fight and die. Kett, buoyed by his earlier victory, refused. Dudley cut off the rebels' supply lines. He used his cavalry to harass their foraging parties. He slowly strangled the vast camp on Mousehold Heath. Realizing they were being starved out, the rebels made a fatal error. They abandoned their high ground and moved into the valley of Dussindale, hoping to catch Dudley in the open. It was exactly what Dudley wanted. On August 27, 1549, the battle was joined. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Dudley's German mercenaries and heavy cavalry smashed into the peasant ranks. The rebels fought bravely, fueled by desperation and religious zeal. But pitchforks cannot stop armored knights. 3,000 Englishmen were slaughtered in the mud of Dussindale. The fields were carpeted with bodies. But in the aftermath, we see a glimpse of Dudley's pragmatism. The local gentry, bloodthirsty for revenge, demanded that every single survivor be hanged. They wanted a holocaust. Dudley stopped them. He reportedly turned to the blood-soaked landlords and asked, "If you kill them all, who will plow your fields?" He was ruthless, but he wasn't a sadist. He executed the ringleaders. Robert Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, his body left to rot as a warning, but he spared the rank and file. He had done the dirty work that Somerset refused to do. He had saved the nobility of England. John Dudley returned to London in September 1549. He was no longer just the Earl of Warwick. He was the savior of the social order. He looked at Somerset, weak, vacillating, hiding in Windsor Castle with the young king, and he saw a liability. He saw a man who had almost crashed the ship of state. The time for loyalty was over. It was time for surgery. The coup that followed in October 1549 was a masterpiece of political choreography. Dudley didn't storm the palace. He simply gathered the disgruntled councillors at his London residence, Ely Place. He formed a united front. They drafted a proclamation stripping Somerset of his power, citing his arrogance, his failure to stop the rebellions, and his bankrupting of the country. Somerset panicked. He grabbed the 11-year-old King Edward and fled to Windsor Castle, issuing hysterical proclamations calling for the peasants to rise up and save him. It was a pathetic end. He was threatening civil war to save his own skin. Dudley remained calm. He wrote respectful letters to the king, assuring the boy that they only meant to remove his evil uncle, not to harm the monarch. The army was with Dudley. The council was with Dudley. Somerset realized the game was up. He surrendered on October 13, 1549, and was escorted to the Tower of London. Now the throne was empty of a protector. The council looked to Dudley. But here, the story takes a twist that reveals the sheer depth of Dudley's Machiavellian brilliance. The coalition that Dudley had built to remove Somerset was dominated by conservatives, Catholics like the Earl of Southampton and the Earl of Arundel. They supported Dudley because they thought he was one of them, or at least that he would reverse the Protestant Reformation and return England to the old faith. They expected a Catholic restoration. For a few weeks, Dudley let them believe it. He played the part. But Dudley knew the most important person in the kingdom was not a duke or an earl. It was the 12-year-old king, Edward VI. And Edward was not just a Protestant. He was a zealot. The boy was obsessed with theology, determined to scrub England clean of popish idolatry. Dudley realized that if he sided with the Catholics, he would make an enemy of the king. If he sided with the king, he could rule for a lifetime. In late 1549, the trap snapped shut. Dudley suddenly turned on his Catholic allies. He declared that he had discovered a popish plot. He purged Southampton and Arundel from the council, locking them out of power. The Catholics were stunned. They had been played. Dudley, the man they thought was their savior, was actually the sword of the Reformation. By February 1550, John Dudley was the undisputed master of England. But he was smarter than Somerset. He refused the title Lord Protector. It carried too much baggage. It sounded too kingly. Instead, he styled himself Lord President of the Council. He claimed to be just the first among equals, a humble servant of the collective will. It was a lie, of course. He was the dictator. But he was a dictator who knew how to smile, how to listen, and how to make the young king feel like he was the one in charge. The Shadow King had ascended. Now he had to govern a bankrupt, broken, and divided nation. Having successfully decapitated the regime of the good Duke, Dudley now found himself holding the prize he had coveted, the helm of the ship of state. But seizing power is a violent act. Keeping it requires a different set of skills entirely. As the dust settled on the coup of 1549, the new master of England had to transform from a conspirator into a statesman. To survive, he knew he could not rule by decree, as Somerset had done. He needed a finer instrument of control. He needed to capture the heart and mind of the one person who mattered more than any army, the boy king himself. By 1550, John Dudley stood alone at the summit. The council was cowed, the conservatives were purged, and his rival Somerset was languishing in the Tower. But Dudley knew that in a monarchy, power does not reside in a council chamber. It resides in the person of the king. His predecessor, Somerset, had made the fatal mistake of treating King Edward VI like a troublesome nephew, keeping him short of money and ignoring his opinions. Dudley did the opposite. He executed a charm offensive that was both cynical and genuinely touching. Dudley recognized that the 12-year-old king was precocious, intelligent, and desperate to be taken seriously. Dudley treated the boy like a small adult. He brought Edward into the heart of government, explaining the intricacies of foreign policy, the boredom of finance, and the strategy of war. He increased the king's allowance, letting the boy feel the power of his own purse. He surrounded the king with men loyal to the Dudley interest, effectively building a golden cage where Edward saw the world only through Dudley's eyes. The result was a bond that went deeper than politics. Edward began to adore Dudley. In his private journal, a cold factual diary that rarely showed emotion, Edward referred to Dudley as his father. For a boy who had lost his own father at 9 and been bullied by his uncle, Dudley was the strong, capable, masculine figure he craved. Was Dudley's affection real? It is the hardest question to answer. Dudley was a master manipulator, and controlling the king was the key to his survival. Yet observers noted a genuine warmth between them. Dudley, the father of 13 children, knew how to talk to boys. But make no mistake, this relationship was the engine of Dudley's dictatorship. As long as the king loved him, Dudley was untouchable. If Somerset was the idealist who broke the country, Dudley was the pragmatist who fixed it. The England he inherited in 1550 was an economic basket case. The wars with Scotland and France were bleeding the treasury dry. The currency was worthless. Henry VIII and Somerset had debased the coinage, mixing so much copper into the silver that the coins turned red when they rubbed against each other in a purse. Inflation was destroying the poor. Dudley made the hard, unpopular decisions that a politician seeking votes would never make. He realized England could not afford to be an empire. In 1550, he signed the Treaty of Boulogne with France. He agreed to return the city of Boulogne, the very city he had conquered in his days of glory, back to the French. It was a national humiliation. The people of London were furious, calling it a surrender. But Dudley secured a massive payment of 400,000 crowns from the French in return. He used that money to stop the bleeding. He then attacked the inflation crisis. He called in the corrupt coinage, melting it down and reissuing money at its true value. It was a painful deflationary shock, but it stabilized the economy. To manage the crown's crippling foreign debts, he didn't just borrow more. He engaged a financial wizard named Thomas Gresham. He sent Gresham to the stock exchange in Antwerp to manipulate the currency markets, essentially playing the exchange rates to lower the interest on England's debt. It was modern statecraft. Dudley wasn't just a warlord anymore. He was a technocrat. He streamlined the government, reduced waste, and cracked down on corruption. Under his steady hand, the panic of 1549 subsided. The fields were plowed, the coins clinked with the sound of real silver, and the fires of rebellion cooled. But there was still a ghost at the feast. Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, was still alive. Dudley had released him from the Tower in early 1550, a gesture of mercy and confidence. He even restored Somerset to the council and married his own eldest son, John, to Somerset's daughter. It was an attempt to heal the wound, to rule together. It was a mistake. Somerset was a man eaten alive by wounded pride. He could not bear to sit at the table where he used to sit at the head. He began to plot. He held secret meetings in the dead of night. He whispered to the king that Dudley was a tyrant. There were rumors, never fully proven but plausible, that Somerset planned to assassinate Dudley and the council at a banquet. Dudley's spy network, led by the efficient Cecil, caught wind of it all. Dudley had tried mercy, now he chose surgery. In October 1551, Somerset was arrested again. This time, there would be no house arrest. He was tried for felony, specifically for plotting to kill a privy councillor. The trial was tense. The London crowd still loved Somerset, remembering his promises of cheap bread. Dudley had to be careful. Somerset was acquitted of treason but convicted of felony. It was a technicality, but it was enough for a death sentence. On January 22, 1552, Somerset was beheaded on Tower Hill. He died well, playing the martyr to the end. The crowd dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood, preserving them as holy relics. In killing Somerset, Dudley secured his physical safety, but he destroyed his reputation forever. To the people, he was now the man who had killed the good Duke. He was the villain of the piece. The wicked Duke legend was born in that blood. With Somerset gone and the king growing older and more fervent in his faith, Dudley took the brakes off the Reformation. The years 1550 to 1553 witnessed a cultural revolution. This was no longer just about breaking with the Pope. This was about scrubbing Catholicism from the soul of England. Stone altars were smashed and replaced with simple wooden tables. Stained glass windows were broken. Statues of saints were decapitated. The rich, sensory world of medieval Christianity was whitewashed into a stark, silent Protestantism. Dudley drove this change with ruthless efficiency. Was he a true believer? His enemies said no. They pointed out that as the church was stripped of its idolatrous wealth, its gold chalices, its embroidered copes, its vast estates, a suspicious amount of that wealth ended up in Dudley's pockets. He became the Duke of Northumberland in October 1551, a title that came with vast lands in the north. He lived like a king, renovating castles and collecting jewels while the church was plundered. However, it is too simple to call him a hypocrite. The two things, piety and greed, were not mutually exclusive to the Tudor mind. Dudley likely believed that he was doing God's work and that he deserved a reward for it. He became the political sword of the radical clergy, men like John Hooper and Nicholas Ridley, who saw in Dudley the Josiah who would purify the temple. Dudley's vision extended beyond the church and the counting house. He looked at the map of the world and saw that England was falling behind. Spain and Portugal controlled the trade routes to the Americas and the Indies. England was an island trapped in a corner of Europe. Dudley wanted to break out. He consulted with the genius mathematician John Dee. Since the southern routes were blocked by Spanish galleons, they looked north. In 1553, Dudley sponsored a daring expedition led by Sir Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor. Their mission was suicidal, to sail north over the top of Scandinavia and find a northeast passage to the fabulous wealth of Cathay. The expedition was a mix of tragedy and triumph. Willoughby and his crew froze to death in the Arctic ice, but Richard Chancellor survived. He managed to land in the White Sea and traveled overland to Moscow, where he met Ivan the Terrible. It was the first contact between England and Russia. Dudley didn't live to see the profits, but he had founded the Muscovy Company. He had turned England's eyes to the horizon. He was laying the blueprints for the British Empire. By the spring of 1553, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had achieved the impossible. The traitor's son was the master of England. The stain of the attainder was washed clean. His family was wealthy, powerful, and married into the highest bloodlines. He had a king who loved him and a country that feared him. He began to relax. He made plans to retire from the daily grind of the council, hoping to focus on his family and his estates. He thought the storm was over. He was wrong. The storm was just gathering. But the foundation of Dudley's new order was dangerously fragile, resting entirely on the beating heart of a sickly teenager. Just as the Duke began to believe his position was secure, biology intervened with a vengeance. By May 1553, the smell of death hung heavy over Greenwich Palace. King Edward VI, the boy of 15, who carried the hopes of the Reformation, was rotting alive. His doctors offered potions of arsenic and pulverized gems, but the tuberculosis was relentless. In this claustrophobic atmosphere, a document was born that would tear the kingdom apart. It was called the Devise for the Succession. Historians have argued for centuries about whose idea it was. Did the wicked Duke of Northumberland force the dying boy to write it? Or was it the fanatical King Edward himself, terrified that his Catholic sister Mary would destroy his church? The truth, as always, is a partnership. Edward provided the religious ideology. Dudley provided the political muscle. It was the boy king's zealotry, as much as Dudley's ambition, that birthed this fatal plan. The devise was a breathtaking piece of legal gymnastics. It sought to overturn the laws of England with a stroke of a pen. Henry VIII's will, ratified by Parliament, had clearly stated the succession. First Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. The devise threw this out the window. It declared both Mary and Elizabeth to be illegitimate bastards. Mary because her mother's marriage was annulled, Elizabeth for the same reason. With the two sisters swept off the board, the crown had to go elsewhere. It bypassed the entire Scottish line and landed on the Suffolk family, specifically the descendants of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary. And who was the eldest available heir in that line? Lady Jane Grey. The timeline is damning for Dudley. As the end drew near, Dudley made a move that would seal his fate. He arranged a marriage. He took his teenage son Guilford Dudley, a handsome but arrogant boy, and married him to Lady Jane Grey. He wasn't just marrying his son to a duchess, he was positioning his family to steal the crown of England. The devise was originally drafted to leave the crown to Lady Jane's heirs male, meaning her unborn sons. But as Edward's death approached rapidly, they realized Jane wouldn't have time to have a son. So, in the final draft, the dying king's shaking hand altered the text. He crossed out Lady Jane's heirs male and changed it to Lady Jane and her heirs male. With 3 words, the crown was gifted to Dudley's new daughter-in-law. Writing a will is one thing, making it legal is another. For the devise to hold water, it needed to be ratified by the leading judges and lawyers of England. On June 11, 1553, Dudley summoned the Lord Chief Justice Edward Montague and the top legal minds to the palace. He presented them with the devise and ordered them to turn it into a legal patent. The judges were horrified. They knew the law better than anyone. They pointed out that the succession had been established by an act of Parliament. The king's will could not override Parliament. To change the succession without Parliament was not just illegal, it was high treason. If they signed this document, they were signing their own death warrants. They refused. Dudley exploded. This was the moment the mask of the suave politician slipped, revealing the desperate thug underneath. He stormed into the council chamber, trembling with rage. He called the judges traitors. He shouted that he was ready to fight in his shirt against anyone who opposed the king's will. The judges looked at the Duke, a man who had killed rebels and beheaded his own rival, and they saw murder in his eyes. They were terrified. A few days later, they were summoned to the king's bedside. The dying boy, gasping for breath, commanded them on their allegiance to sign. Caught between a furious duke and a dying king, the lawyers crumbled. One by one, weeping and begging for pardons, they signed the devise. Dudley had his piece of paper. He thought it was a shield. In reality, it was just ink. It could not stop the storm that was coming. On the evening of July 6, 1553, a thunderstorm raged over London. Lightning cracked the sky and rain lashed the palace roofs. Inside, in the stifling heat of the sick room, King Edward VI whispered his final prayer and died. He was 15 years old. The king was dead. Long live the queen. But which queen? Dudley immediately went into crisis mode. He knew that possession was 9/10 of the law. He needed to secure the Tower of London, the Treasury, and the Navy. But most of all, he needed to capture Mary Tudor. If Mary was free, she was a rallying point for every malcontent in the kingdom. If she was in a cell, the coup was a fait accompli. Dudley kept the king's death a total secret. He closed the palace gates. He sent no messengers. For 2 whole days, the people of London went about their business, unaware that their king was a corpse. During this silence, Dudley sent a sweet letter to Mary, who was staying in Hertfordshire. He invited her to come to London to visit her dying brother. It was a trap. He had cavalry waiting on the road to intercept her and drag her to the Tower. This is the moment where history turned. Mary Tudor was not the weeping victim Dudley expected. She was the granddaughter of Isabella of Castile, the warrior queen of Spain. She had steel in her spine. As Mary rode toward London on July 6th, a secret messenger intercepted her. We still don't know who sent the warning. Perhaps a double agent in Dudley's council, perhaps a sympathetic goldsmith. The message was simple. The king is dead. Dudley is setting a trap. Turn back. Mary didn't hesitate. She spun her horse around and rode north. She didn't stop. She rode through the night, covering an impossible distance, heading deep into East Anglia, to her estates at Kenninghall, and then to the fortress of Framlingham. This was Dudley's fatal error. He had assumed Mary would be paralyzed by fear. Instead, she was raising the standard of rebellion. From the safety of Framlingham Castle, she declared herself queen. She sent letters to the nobility, demanding their allegiance, and, defying all of Dudley's calculations, the nobility answered. Men who had silently hated Dudley for years, Catholic gentry, conservative lords, even commoners who missed the old ways, flocked to Mary's banner. Within days, she had an army. Back in London, Dudley's plan was unraveling. On July 10th, 4 days after the king's death, he finally played his hand. Lady Jane Grey was brought by barge to the Tower of London. She was 16, tiny, and terrified. When Dudley and her parents told her she was now queen, she fainted. When she woke up, she wept, crying out that the crown was not her right, that it belonged to Mary. But she was a child in a room full of ambitious adults. She was bullied into accepting. That afternoon, the heralds rode into the city and proclaimed Jane as queen. Dudley expected cheers. He expected the Protestant city of London to rejoice that they had been saved from a Catholic queen. Instead, he got silence. The crowd listened to the proclamation with stony faces. There were no shouts of "God save the Queen." A lone potboy made a joke about the new queen and was immediately arrested and had his ears cut off. The silence of the crowd was more terrifying than a riot. It was the sound of a city that knew a crime was being committed. Dudley was shaken. He realized he had miscalculated the mood of the nation. The English people might have been Protestant, but they were Legitimists first. They believed in the bloodline. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII. Jane was just a cousin, a puppet of the hated Duke. Reports began to flood into the council chamber. Mary's army in East Anglia was growing by the hour. 10,000, 15,000 men. She had seized ships. The crews of the naval squadron Dudley sent to intercept her had mutinied and joined her. The Privy Council in London was in a panic. They knew they had to send an army to crush Mary before she marched on London. But who would lead it? The obvious choice was the Duke of Suffolk, Jane's father. But Jane, showing a sudden flash of spirit, refused to let him go. She wouldn't let her father risk his life. The council turned to Dudley. "You are the greatest soldier in the realm," they told him. "You are the terror of the Scots. Only you can defeat Mary." Dudley looked at their faces. He saw the fear, but he also saw the treachery. He knew it was a trap. If he stayed in London, he could keep his boot on their necks. If he left, he lost control of the government. But he had no choice. If Mary wasn't stopped, they were all dead. On July 14th, Dudley prepared to ride out. He assembled a force of 3,000 troops, far fewer than he needed. As he mounted his horse, he turned to the council members, who were swearing their undying loyalty to him. His words were prophetic. "My lords," he said, his eyes scanning their faces, "I and these other noblemen are going forth to adventure our lives for you and for the promotion of the Queen's cause. But I fear that as soon as I am gone, you will betray me." He was riding into the abyss, and he knew it. As the city gates closed behind him, the silence of the London crowds was soon replaced by the whispers of desertion in his own camp. The road to Cambridge became a slow, suffocating nightmare. He was not marching to glory, he was marching into a vacuum. He was the finest general in England, the hero of Pinkie Clough and Dussindale, but an army is only as strong as its morale. And his army was rotten. The soldiers knew they were marching against the rightful heir, Mary Tudor. They were mercenaries and retainers, paid to fight, but they were also Englishmen who feared the wrath of God for usurping the bloodline. Disaster struck almost immediately. As they camped at night, men slipped away into the darkness, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The desertion was contagious. Officers reported that their men refused to salute, grumbling that they would not fight for Queen Jane. Dudley tried to project confidence. He sent letters back to the council in London demanding reinforcements, demanding fresh horses, demanding loyalty. But the silence from the capital was deafening. He reached Cambridge on July 15th, hoping to regroup. Instead, he found himself isolated. The great lords of East Anglia were not joining him. They were joining Mary. He was a shark stranded on a beach, thrashing as the tide went out. While Dudley was stalled in Cambridge, the inevitable betrayal took place in London. The Privy Council, the men who had sworn on their souls to support him just days earlier, sensed the change in the wind. They were rats on a sinking ship, and they knew they had to jump before the water closed over their heads. The ringleader was the Earl of Arundel. He was a conservative who had hated Dudley for years, but had played the loyal servant to survive. Now his moment of revenge had arrived. On July 19th, while Dudley was still waiting for orders, the council met not at the Tower, but at Baynard's Castle, a safe distance away. Arundel spoke plainly. "The game is up. If we support Jane, we die. If we proclaim Mary, we might live." It was that simple. Within hours, they drafted a proclamation declaring Mary Tudor to be the true Queen of England. They rode into Cheapside and read it to the people. This time there was no silence. The city of London exploded. Bonfires were lit, church bells rang until they cracked, and people danced in the streets drinking wine. The relief was palpable. The tyranny of the Duke was over. The rightful Queen had returned. The Duke of Suffolk, Jane's father, heard the cheering from the Tower. He knew instantly what it meant. In a pathetic act of survival, he walked into his daughter's room, the throne room, and tore down the canopy of state over her head. He told Jane she was no longer queen and must go home. He then ran out onto Tower Hill and proclaimed Mary himself, desperate to save his own skin. Lady Jane Grey was left alone in the wreckage, a queen for 9 days, now a prisoner of state. The news reached John Dudley in Cambridge the next morning, July 20th. It is hard to imagine the psychological collapse of a man like Dudley in that moment. For 20 years, he had been the master of his destiny. He had outwitted everyone. Now he was checkmated by a woman he had underestimated and a council he had foolishly trusted. He didn't try to fight. He didn't try to flee to the coast. He simply gave up. In the marketplace of Cambridge, a surreal scene unfolded. The terrifying Duke of Northumberland, surrounded by a bewildered crowd, personally tore down the proclamations of Queen Jane that he had posted just days before. He took off his velvet cap, the symbol of his noble rank, and tossed it into the air. Tears streamed down his face as he shouted, "God save Queen Mary!" It was a humiliating, desperate performance. He was trying to show that he too was a loyal subject, that it had all been a misunderstanding. He laughed, he cried, he acted like a man whose mind had snapped. It didn't work. The crowd stared at him with contempt. The next morning, the Earl of Arundel arrived from London. He wasn't there to greet an old friend. He was there to arrest a traitor. Dudley fell to his knees at Arundel's feet, the same man who had plotted with him weeks earlier, and begged for his life. "Be good to me, for the love of God," he pleaded. "Consider I have done nothing but by the consent of you all." Arundel looked down at him coldly. "My lord," he said, "I am sent hither by the Queen's Majesty, and in her name I do arrest you." The journey back to London was a via dolorosa. Dudley was tied to a horse surrounded by guards. As they passed through the city of London, the hatred of the people was unleashed. Crowds lined the streets, thousands deep. They didn't just jeer, they threw stones, offal, and mud. They screamed, "Traitor" and "Murderer." Women held up their children to see the wicked Duke brought low. The bitterness over the execution of Somerset, the resentment of his greed, the fear of his ambition, it all came pouring out. Dudley sat with his head bowed, his once magnificent clothes stained with filth. He was taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress he had commanded days before, and thrown into the Beauchamp Tower. His 5 sons were arrested with him. His wife was left destitute. The Dudley Empire had been erased in a week. On August 18th, 1553, John Dudley was brought to Westminster Hall to stand trial for high treason. It was a piece of theater, not justice. The outcome was scripted, but the casting was the ultimate insult. The jury of peers sitting in judgment over him included the very men who had signed the devise alongside him. The Earl of Arundel, who had arrested him, sat on the bench. Dudley, standing alone in the dock, was still the sharpest legal mind in the room. He raised 2 points of law that should have saved him. First, he asked, "Is it treason to obey a warrant under the Great Seal of England?" He argued that he had acted under the orders of King Edward VI and the Great Seal. He was just a soldier following orders. Second, he asked, "Can men who were equally guilty of the crime sit as my judges?" He pointed at the jury, essentially saying, "If I am guilty, you are all guilty too." It was a brilliant defense. It was unanswerable. But this was a political trial. The judges simply brushed his arguments aside. They ruled that the Great Seal of a usurper was invalid and that the peers on the jury had been pardoned by Queen Mary and were therefore innocent. The verdict was delivered, guilty. The sentence, to be drawn, hanged, and quartered. Dudley didn't rage. He bowed. He asked only one favor, that his death be by the axe, rather than the agonizing torture of hanging and quartering. And he asked for mercy for his children. "They went by my commandment," he said. "They are young. They knew no better." While waiting for death, Dudley made one final, shocking move. On August 21st, the day before his execution, he attended a Catholic Mass in the Tower Chapel. The man who had led the radical Protestant Reformation, who had smashed the altars and stripped the churches, stood before the world and declared it was all a lie. He confessed that he had been seduced by false preachers. He proclaimed his belief in the Pope and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Why? For centuries, Protestants called him a coward, a man with no soul who would say anything to save his skin. Catholics called it a miracle, proof that Protestantism was a hollow sham. But the truth is likely more tragic. Dudley knew he was going to die. But his sons, Guilford, Robert, Ambrose, Henry, were also in the Tower, facing the axe. He knew Queen Mary was a devout Catholic. He likely calculated that if he gave her a great propaganda victory, if the leader of the Reformation publicly converted, she might be merciful to his family. He sold his soul to save his children. It was his final deal. The morning of August 22nd, 1553 was bright and clear. A crowd of 10,000 people packed Tower Hill. They had come to see the monster die. Dudley walked up the scaffold. He was dressed in a gown of cream-colored damask. He looked tired, but calm. He leaned on the rail and spoke to the vast crowd. It was a conventional scaffold speech. He admitted he was a sinner. He admitted he deserved to die. He repeated his Catholic conversion, warning the crowd to avoid the new preaching that had caused all the rebellions and misery of the past years. He then knelt in the straw. The executioner, a man whose name is lost to history, asked his forgiveness. Dudley gave it. He blindfolded himself. He groped for the block, muttering a prayer. He laid his neck on the wood. The axe swung. In that singular, violent moment, the cycle completed itself. John Dudley died on the exact same spot, in the exact same way, for the exact same crime. As the father he had spent 40 years trying to avenge. The blood of the son mingled with the ghost of the father. He was buried quickly in the chapel of St. Peter, ad Vincula, within the tower. They placed his body under the flagstones of the chancel. Ironically, he lies between two other headless ghosts, Anne Boleyn and his old rival, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. The Shadow King was dead. The axe that severed John Dudley's life did not sever the tragedy that engulfed his name. While the crowd dispersed, satisfied that justice had been done, the shadow of the scaffold lengthened to cover those he left behind. The wicked Duke was gone, but his widow and children remained trapped in the wreckage of his ambition. Locked in the cold stone cells of the tower, the surviving Dudleys waited in agonizing silence to see if the Queen's mercy would extend to the innocent offspring of a guilty father, or if the entire dynasty was destined to be wiped from the earth. John Dudley had gambled everything, his life, his fortune, and his children's blood, and he had lost it all. Now the wreckage of his ambition lay scattered across the Tower of London. His widow, Jane Guilford, the Duchess of Northumberland, was left in a position of utter destitution. The crown had confiscated everything, the castles, the silver plate, the tapestries, even her clothes. She was kicked out of her home, a pariah in a city that hated her name. Yet in these dark months, this remarkable woman displayed a courage that matched her husband's. Dying of illness and heartbroken, she spent her final days relentlessly petitioning the Queen, lobbying Spanish ambassadors, and pulling every remaining string to save her surviving sons from the executioner. And she had reason to be terrified. Locked inside the Beauchamp Tower were the Dudley boys, John, Ambrose, Robert, Henry, and the fateful Guilford. If you visit the Tower of London today, you can walk into the Beauchamp Tower and touch the physical evidence of their despair. On the cold stone walls, the Dudley brothers carved elaborate graffiti to pass the terrifying hours while they waited to die. The most famous carving is an intricate design by John, the eldest brother. It features the family crest, the bare and ragged staff surrounded by a border of roses, oak leaves, geraniums, and honeysuckle. Beneath it, he carved a haunting, incomplete word, yowing, perhaps meant to be Ewing, a reference to family loyalty, or a name. It is a silent scream from the past, a testament to a brotherhood bonded by blood and impending doom. They were young men, the flower of the English nobility, now rotting in a damp cell because of their father's sins. Queen Mary I was not by nature a bloodthirsty woman. In the initial flush of victory, she was inclined to be merciful. She recognized that Lady Jane Grey and Guilford Dudley were merely pawns in the Duke's game. She famously said of Jane, "She is just a child manipulated by others." For a few months in late 1553, it seemed possible that they might survive. Jane lived in reasonable comfort in the gentleman jailer's lodgings. She ate at the Queen's expense. The axe had been sheathed. But politics is cruel, and mercy is a luxury that insecure monarchs cannot afford. In early 1554, the political weather turned violently against the Dudleys. Queen Mary announced her intention to marry King Philip II of Spain. The English people were horrified. They hated the idea of a Spanish king. Xenophobia and religious fear swept the country. This unrest boiled over into Wyatt's rebellion. In January 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt raised an army in Kent and marched on London to stop the Spanish marriage. It was a serious threat. Wyatt's troops actually reached the gates of the city. Although the rebellion was crushed, it sealed the fate of the prisoners in the Tower. Even though Jane Grey had nothing to do with Wyatt, her father, the Duke of Suffolk, had foolishly joined the rebels. Mary's advisors, and crucially the Spanish ambassadors, told the Queen the hard truth. As long as Jane Grey is alive, she is a focal point for treason. You cannot have a Spanish marriage while a rival queen breathes. Mary, with a heavy heart, signed the death warrants. February 12, 1554, was the final tragic coda to John Dudley's ambition. Guilford Dudley, John's 19-year-old son, was brought out first. He was not a particularly likable boy. He was arrogant and spoiled, but he was undeniably a victim of his father's plotting. He wept as he was led to Tower Hill. He was beheaded before a silent crowd. His body was thrown into a cart. As the cart rumbled back toward the Tower Chapel, it passed directly underneath the window of Lady Jane Grey. She looked down and saw the headless, bloody corpse of her husband. She whispered, "Oh, Guilford, Guilford," and then prepared herself for her own end. Jane's execution was private, held within the Tower Green. She was 16 years old. She walked to the scaffold with a composure that shamed the grown men around her. She recited Psalm 51. She tied the blindfold around her own eyes. Then came the moment of heartbreaking pathos that has been immortalized in paintings ever since. Blindfolded, she reached out for the executioner's block, but she couldn't find it. She panicked, her hands grasping at empty air, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A bystander gently guided her hands to the wood. She laid her head down. The axe fell. With that blow, the Dudley plot was truly finished. The kingmaker, his son, and his queen were all dead. The bloodletting stopped there. Queen Mary had had enough of death. The remaining Dudley brothers, Ambrose, Robert, and Henry, were kept in the Tower for another year. They were stripped of their titles, their lands, and their dignity, but they were allowed to keep their heads. However, the Tower took its toll in other ways. The eldest brother, John, died shortly after his release in October 1554, his body broken by the damp conditions of the prison. The Dudley dynasty was whittled down to a nub. When the survivors were finally released, they were nobodies. They were the sons of a traitor, banned from court, impoverished, and watched by spies. They were expected to fade into obscurity, to vanish from the pages of history. But one of them refused to fade. Among the survivors was the fifth son, Robert Dudley. He was tall, dark, and possessed all of his father's charisma, but with a smoother, more courtly edge. During his time in the Tower, he had forged a bond with another prisoner, a young, fiery-haired woman who was also living in fear of her sister, the Queen. That woman was the Princess Elizabeth. Though they had known each other as children, it was the dark months in the Tower, living under the constant threat of the axe, that forged an unbreakable bond between Robert and the future Queen. John Dudley's ambition had destroyed his family, but unknowingly he had positioned his son Robert to achieve exactly what John had failed to do. But before we can understand the rise of the son, we must deliver the final verdict on the father. John Dudley lay in his grave, reviled as a monster. But was he? As the Tudor era faded and the dust settled, historians began to look at the wicked Duke with fresh eyes. And what they found was not a monster, but a man who was tragically ahead of his time. For nearly 400 years after his head fell into the straw on Tower Hill, John Dudley was the villain of the English story. History is written by the victors, and in 1553, the victors were Mary Tudor and the Catholic faction. To justify their coup and the execution of the leading men of the realm, they needed a monster. They needed a scapegoat on whom they could pin all the sins of the previous reign. John Dudley was perfect for the role. The Tudor propaganda machine painted him as the Bear of Warwick, a beast who mauled everything in his path. It was only in the late 20th century that historians began to scrape away the layers of Tudor mud. When they looked at the actual state papers, the ledgers, the council minutes, the naval records, they found a startlingly different man. They found that John Dudley was arguably the most capable administrator of the mid-Tudor period. He was the man who stopped the runaway inflation that was starving the poor. He was the man who had the courage to end the ruinous wars with France and Scotland, realizing that England needed peace more than it needed glory. But his greatest legacy lies on the water. When the English fleet sailed out to meet the Spanish Armada in 1588, they were sailing in ships designed according to Dudley's principles and using tactics he had pioneered. The guns that saved England from Spain were cast in the foundries John Dudley built. However, the story has one final ironic twist. John Dudley's dream was to place his bloodline on the throne. He failed with Guilford and Lady Jane Grey, but his son, Robert Dudley, survived the axe. Robert became the great love of Queen Elizabeth I. For 30 years, the traitor's son was the most powerful man in England, the eyes to the Queen. He was the uncrowned king in all but name. In a strange way, John Dudley won in the end. He didn't get the crown, but his DNA, his political style, and his vision shaped the Elizabethan Golden Age through his son. The bear and ragged staff, the Dudley emblem, did not vanish. It flew over the court of the greatest queen in English history. John Dudley was not a hero. He was a man of his time, ruthless, acquisitive, and willing to kill to maintain his position. But he was not a monster. He was a brilliant, flawed man operating in a shark tank. He is the Icarus of the Tudor age. He crafted wings out of sheer competence and will, determined to fly out of the dark shadow of his father's scaffold. He flew higher than any commoner had ever dared to fly, touching the very face of the sun. But he forgot that wax melts. His fall was inevitable, terrified, and total. Without the Shadow King, there would have been no stability for Edward VI, no foundation for the Elizabethan Navy, and perhaps no Golden Age. He remains the most fascinating might have been in English history.